January 26, 1945. The snow had stopped falling, but the cold had not eased. Near the small Alsatian village of Holtzwihr, the ground lay frozen, hard enough to turn shallow foxholes into shallow graves. The trees were bare, their branches black against a pale winter sky. Smoke drifted low across the fields, hanging just above the ground where artillery had churned the earth into mud and ice. The American line here was thin, too thin. For days, German forces inside the Colmar pocket had resisted every attempt to break them loose. They were dug in, experienced, and increasingly desperate. That morning, they counterattacked hard, throwing infantry and armor forward with the kind of determination that came from knowing retreat was no longer an option. An American company from the 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, took the brunt of it. They were outnumbered, they were exposed, and they were running out of room. Machine gun fire cut across the open ground, snapping low over the frozen soil. Mortar rounds landed behind the American positions, walking forward in tight, methodical patterns. Men pressed themselves into the earth, gripping rifles with numb hands, waiting for orders that had not yet come. Near the center of the line stood a second lieutenant, slight, quiet, and already far too familiar with combat. Audie Murphy had been fighting almost continuously for more than 2 years. He had survived North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and southern France. He had been wounded more than once. He had been promoted, decorated, and sent back into the line again and again. By January of 1945, he had learned something most soldiers learned only at great cost. When a line breaks, it does not break evenly. It breaks where pressure concentrates. That morning, pressure was concentrating fast. A German infantry company was advancing through the woods and fields toward Murphy's position, supported by tanks that moved with slow, deliberate confidence. American fire checked them briefly, then faltered. Ammunition ran low. Communication broke down. Orders stopped arriving. One by one, American positions began to fold backward. Murphy saw it happening. He ordered his men to pull back into the woods behind them, to take cover and reorganize. They hesitated. Leaving a position under fire was always dangerous. Murphy stayed behind. Ahead of him, a tank destroyer, a US M10, burned fiercely, flames licking from its engine compartment. Its crew had abandoned it moments earlier after it was hit. Ammunition inside the vehicle crackled as it cooked off, sending sharp metallic pops through the air. Murphy climbed onto it anyway. He mounted the .50 caliber machine gun fixed to the turret, fully aware that the burning vehicle made him the most visible man on the battlefield. From that position, he could see the German advance clearly. They were close now, close enough to kill him quickly. What happened next would last nearly an hour, and for most of that time, Audie Murphy stood alone. Audie Murphy was not built for war in the way popular imagination prefers. He was small, slight, and soft-spoken, standing barely over 5 feet 5 inches and weighing little more than 100 pounds when he enlisted. Nothing about his appearance suggested endurance, let alone the capacity to withstand sustained combat. But war has never cared much for appearances. Murphy was born in 1925 in rural Texas, one of 12 children raised in deep poverty. His childhood was marked by instability, hunger, and responsibility far beyond his years. His father drifted away. His mother struggled to hold the family together. When she died while Murphy was still a teenager, the family fractured. School ended early for him. Survival did not. By the time he tried to enlist, Murphy had already learned how to shoulder responsibility quietly, without recognition, because there was no alternative. He had hunted to feed his siblings. He had learned patience, self-reliance, and how to function under stress long before he ever put on a uniform. When the United States entered the war, Murphy tried to enlist immediately. He was turned away. The Army said he was too young. The Navy said he was too small. The Marines said the same. Eventually, the Army accepted him. Once overseas, Murphy adapted with a speed that surprised everyone around him, including his superiors. He learned to rein quickly. He learned how to read enemy movement. He learned when to follow orders exactly and when hesitation would get men killed. He did not talk much. He did not posture. He watched. In combat, Murphy showed a consistent pattern that would later define his reputation. He did not seek danger, but when danger arrived, he moved toward the point of greatest pressure. He took responsibility not because it brought recognition, but because someone had to act before the situation collapsed. This pattern repeated itself across multiple campaigns. In Sicily, he led men under fire when officers went down. In Italy, he held positions long enough for wounded soldiers to be evacuated. In southern France, he attacked enemy positions alone when flanking maneuvers stalled. Each time, the official language of the citations focused on courage. What those citations rarely captured was the underlying logic. Murphy understood something fundamental about combat. Moments mattered more than plans. Doctrine assumed coordination. Reality produced fragmentation. And in that fragmentation, survival depended on who could think and act when systems failed. By late 1944, Murphy was already one of the most decorated enlisted men in the U.S. Army. He carried multiple Silver Stars, Bronze Stars, Purple Hearts, and foreign decorations. But none of that mattered on January 26, 1945. Decorations did not stop bullets. Reputation did not slow tanks. The only thing that mattered that morning was whether someone could hold the line long enough for it to stabilize. Murphy understood the odds. A single man on a burning vehicle was not supposed to survive. German infantry advancing with armor support were not supposed to be stopped by one machine gun. The calculations were obvious. Murphy climbed onto the tank destroyer anyway. Not because he believed he was invincible, but because he knew exactly what would happen if he did not. By the winter of 1944, the war in Western Europe was no longer moving forward in clean lines. It was grinding. The Allied advance had stalled in several places, not because of a lack of strength, but because German forces had chosen where to make their stand carefully. One of those places was eastern France, along the upper Rhine River, in a region known as the Colmar Pocket. The pocket existed because the Germans refused to retreat across the Rhine. Instead, they dug in around the Alsatian city of Colmar, holding a wedge of territory that threatened Allied supply routes and prevented a clean southern advance into Germany. For the men fighting there, the pocket felt less like a battlefield and more like a trap. Winter had arrived early and hard. Snow and freezing rain turned fields into mud and mud into ice. Weapons malfunctioned, vehicles bogged down. Frostbite claimed men as reliably as enemy fire. German units inside the pocket were experienced and motivated. Many had nowhere else to go. They knew the terrain, they knew the weather favored the defender, and they knew the Americans had to come to them. By January 1945, the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division had been fighting almost continuously for weeks, pushing village by village, tree line by tree line. Casualties were heavy. Rest was rare. On January 26th, German forces launched a counterattack near Holtzwihr, a small village surrounded by open fields, woods, and drainage ditches that offered little natural cover. The attack was well timed. American units were stretched thin.
Artillery support was limited by weather and visibility. Communications were unreliable. German infantry advanced in coordination with armor, using smoke and terrain to mask their movement. This was exactly the kind of situation doctrine warned about, and exactly the kind of situation doctrine rarely prepared men to survive. Murphy's unit was positioned along a shallow defensive line meant to slow the German advance, not stop it outright. They were expected to delay, then withdraw in good order once pressure became too great. But pressure built faster than expected. German infantry pushed forward aggressively, probing for weak points. Tanks followed, their presence alone enough to unsettle men pinned in shallow foxholes. Mortar fire fell with growing accuracy. The American line began to bend, then it began to break. Officers shouted orders that were half-heard and poorly relayed. Some men pulled back, others stayed put, uncertain whether withdrawal was authorized or abandonment. This was how lines collapsed, not in dramatic charges or sudden routs, but in small, disconnected moments of hesitation and confusion. Murphy saw the break coming. He ordered his men to fall back into the woods behind the line, where they could regroup and establish a new defensive position. They moved reluctantly, knowing that movement under fire was dangerous, but trusting his judgment. Murphy did not follow them. He stayed forward, alone, watching the German advance close the distance. Nearby, the M10 tank destroyer burned steadily, its metal hull radiating heat into the freezing air. The crew had escaped moments earlier after enemy fire disabled it. Flames crawled up its sides, smoke pouring from the engine compartment. To most men, it was a hazard to avoid. To Murphy, it was an opportunity. From its elevated position, the tank destroyer offered visibility across the open ground. Mounted on its turret was a .50 caliber machine gun with a clear field of fire. It was also the most exposed position on the battlefield. Murphy understood that, too. He climbed onto the vehicle anyway.
Murphy mounted the burning tank destroyer with full awareness that he had become a target. The flames below him crackled and popped as ammunition inside the vehicle cooked off, sending sharp metallic reports into the air. Smoke drifted across his field of view, stinging his eyes and forcing him to blink repeatedly to keep the advancing Germans in sight. He keyed his radio and began calling in artillery fire. The line was already broken, but artillery could still disrupt the advance, force the enemy to slow, to hesitate, to seek cover. Murphy adjusted fire by sound and intuition, relaying corrections as shells landed among the German formations. At the same time, he manned the .50 caliber machine gun. From his elevated position, Murphy had a clear view of the German infantry advancing through the snow-covered fields and tree lines. They were spread out, moving cautiously but confidently, expecting little resistance from a position they believed already neutralized. Murphy opened fire. The heavy machine gun roared, its recoil hammering through the turret and into his arms. Tracer rounds cut across the field, stitching through German formations and forcing men to dive for cover. The effect was immediate. German infantry halted, uncertain where the fire was coming from and how strong the American position still was. Some attempted to advance, others dropped flat, pinned by the volume and accuracy of the fire. Murphy fired in controlled bursts, conserving ammunition, shifting targets deliberately. He focused on movement, on figures breaking cover, on officers trying to reorganize the advance. Enemy fire answered back. Small arms rounds snapped past him. Mortar fragments tore into the ground around the tank destroyer. German tanks adjusted their fire, shells impacting nearby with concussive force. Murphy remained exposed. For nearly an hour, he stayed on the burning vehicle, firing, adjusting artillery,
and denying the Germans the momentum they needed to overrun the position. At some point during the engagement, Murphy was wounded in the leg. He did not climb down. Pain mattered less than time, and time was exactly what he was buying. The Germans attempted to flank the position. Murphy shifted fire. They tried to rush forward under cover of smoke. Murphy adjusted artillery again, breaking up the assault before it could gain traction. From the German perspective, the resistance did not make sense. An American position that should have collapsed was still holding. A line that should have been empty was pouring fire into their advance. They were losing men to a defender who refused to disappear. What they did not know was that the defense consisted of a single soldier. Below and behind Murphy, his company regrouped in the woods. They reorganized, redistributed ammunition, and prepared to counterattack. When Murphy finally exhausted the machine gun's ammunition, he climbed down from the tank destroyer. Then he did something even more unexpected. He limped back to his men, took command of the reorganized elements, and led them forward in a counterattack. The German advance stalled completely. Faced with renewed resistance and mounting casualties, German forces withdrew, abandoning the push that had threatened to collapse the American line entirely. The position at Holtzwihr held. The line stabilized, and the battle moved on. When the firing finally stopped, Murphy collapsed from exhaustion and blood loss. Medics treated his wound. Officers took statements. Reports were written. Only then did the full scale of what had happened begin to settle in. A single soldier had held off an entire German company, not through brute force alone, but through time, judgment, and a refusal to yield when the line around him disappeared. The stand at Holtzwihr would later be described in official language as an act of extraordinary heroism. But for the men who were there, it was something simpler. It was the reason they were still alive.
In the hours after the fighting near Holtzwihr subsided, the battlefield looked unremarkable. The burned-out tank destroyer still smoldered in the cold air. Shell craters scarred the frozen fields. German bodies lay where the advance had broken apart, partially covered by snow kicked up during the fight. There was no ceremony. There rarely was. Medics treated the wounded. Officers accounted for men and equipment. Reports were written in clipped, practical language meant to restore order after chaos. The war did not pause to reflect on what had just happened. But word moved quickly. Within the company, it was immediately understood that something extraordinary had occurred. Men who had withdrawn into the woods under pressure realized only later how close they had come to being overrun. They understood that the time they needed to reorganize had been purchased at a cost they could barely comprehend. Murphy was evacuated for treatment, his leg wound cleaned and bandaged. He did not dramatize what he had done. He answered questions when asked, briefly and without embellishment. Others filled in the gaps. Officers who reviewed the reports struggled to reconcile the language on the page with the reality it described. A single non-commissioned officer had manned an exposed machine gun on a burning vehicle, called artillery fire under direct attack, and held off a reinforced enemy infantry element for nearly an hour. The recommendation for the Medal of Honor followed swiftly, not because the Army was eager to create heroes, but because the scale of the action left little room for ambiguity. The documentation was extensive, witness statements aligned, tactical outcomes were clear. The German advance had been stopped. An American line that should have collapsed had held, and it had held because one man refused to leave. When the Medal of Honor was awarded later that year, it joined a list of decorations already unlike any other in the U.S. Army.
Murphy had received the Distinguished Service Cross, multiple Silver Stars, Bronze Stars for Valor, Purple Hearts, and foreign awards from France and Belgium. By the end of the war, he had received every American Military Combat Award for valor available to an enlisted soldier. The phrase "most decorated" followed naturally. It was accurate. It was also incomplete, because medals recorded moments. They did not record what those moments cost.
The United States emerged from World War II victorious, but deeply unsettled. Millions of men came home carrying experiences that defied easy explanation. The country needed stories that made sense of the sacrifice, stories that framed the war as something survivable, comprehensible, and ultimately redemptive. Audie Murphy fit that need almost perfectly. He was young, he was modest, he looked like the boy next door rather than a hardened killer. When newsreels and newspapers introduced him to the public, they did so with language that emphasized grit, courage, and determination. His medals were displayed. His actions were summarized in clean, heroic terms. The complexity was smoothed away. Murphy did not seek this attention, but he did not reject it either. He understood that the story no longer belonged entirely to him. It had become part of a national narrative about victory and resilience. Hollywood noticed almost immediately. Murphy's autobiography, To Hell and Back, was published in 1949 and quickly became a bestseller. It presented his wartime experiences in direct, unsentimental language, avoiding self-praise while still recounting intense combat. In 1955, it was adapted into a feature film. Murphy played himself. The decision was unprecedented and revealing. No actor could plausibly portray what he had done better than the man who had done it. Yet the act of reenacting his own war blurred lines between memory and performance, between experience and myth. The film was a commercial success. Murphy became a movie star. To audiences, he represented a reassuring idea that even the most extreme violence of the war could be contained within a single, heroic figure, and that figure could walk away, smile for cameras, and move on. That image mattered. It helped a country believe that its veterans would be fine. As Murphy's acting career continued, the public image solidified. He appeared in dozens of films, often playing soldiers, lawmen, or stoic men of action. His presence carried an unspoken authority. Viewers knew he had done the real thing. Hollywood framed him as proof that the war had produced not only heroes, but stable ones, men who could reintegrate seamlessly into civilian life and even thrive. But film sets were controlled environments. They had scripts. They had retakes. They had clear beginnings and endings. Murphy's memories did not. Behind the scenes, the war followed him relentlessly. He struggled with chronic insomnia, violent nightmares, and periods of deep depression. Loud noises triggered reactions he could not control. Sleep came only with medication. For years, he slept with a loaded pistol under his pillow. At the time, there was no language for what he was experiencing. The term post-traumatic stress disorder did not exist. Combat fatigue was acknowledged only briefly, often dismissed as weakness or temporary strain. Veterans were expected to adjust on their own. Murphy tried. He sought structure in work. He maintained a public image of composure and discipline. He avoided discussing the darker aspects of his experiences in detail, even as they shaped his private life. The contrast between the on-screen hero and the man off-camera grew sharper with time. Audiences saw courage frozen in black-and-white frames. Murphy lived with its consequences every night. In later years, Murphy spoke more openly about the psychological cost of combat.
not to diminish what he had done, but to clarify it. He understood that medals and movies told only part of the story. They honored moments of extraordinary action, but they did not prepare society for what came after the applause faded. Murphy became an advocate, quietly but persistently, for greater recognition of the mental health struggles faced by returning veterans. He described nightmares, anxiety, and the difficulty of functioning in a world that expected normalcy without understanding what had been endured. His words mattered because of who he was. If the most decorated American soldier of the war could be haunted by its aftermath, then the problem could not be dismissed as individual weakness. It was systemic. Murphy died in 1971, killed in a plane crash at the age of 45. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, his grave marked not by an elaborate monument, but by a simple white headstone, one he had personally requested, without special embellishment. In time, his name became associated not only with valor, but with care. The Audie Murphy Memorial Veterans Hospital in San Antonio was named in his honor, linking his legacy permanently to the well-being of those who followed him into uniform. Today, Audie Murphy is remembered as a hero, a symbol, and a legend. All of those labels are accurate. None of them are complete. On January 26, 1945, at Holtzwihr, a single soldier held off an entire German company because the line behind him was breaking and someone had to stand. He stood. What followed, the medals, the fame, the films, grew outward from that moment. But the cost of standing did not end when the firing stopped. It stayed with him for the rest of his life. That is the full measure of Audie Murphy's story. Not just how long he stood alone under fire, but how long he carried it afterward.